record. But again, I do ask that if you have not spoken to me already, please turn on your cameras for course engagement. And once everybody's camera's on, we'll go ahead and get started. I think Hayden, I know that you spoke to me. Kelly, you spoke to me. Anyone else? I don't believe I heard from you. So Jonathan, Naomi, and Alexis, you all should have your cameras on, please.
Unfortunately, the computer I'm using right now does not have a webcam.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah. Just for today, though. Apologies.
It's all good. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we had 3 breakout questions on the table. What's the thesis of the reading? What was your contemporary analysis of the reading? And then how does the information you came across in the reading inform the possibilities for Black and Brown relations in our contemporary world? Who would like to start us off? So the thesis, the contemporary analysis, and what are the implications based on the reading for Black and Brown relations in our modern world? Who would like to lead the discussion?
I could start it off, but I'll go ahead and say I did have to go back because I was a little bit confused in regards to what week we were studying. I was on week 5, so I had to kind of refresh my memory on that. I didn't get the thesis down, but I will say from what I read or what I skimmed through is that there was an influence on both sides as far as what was going on. And Amani had touched on this in our breakout rooms, the trades that were going on, certain how the Africans had to travel, how they ended up in Mexico and so on.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Harlan, in the sense of the contributions from both sides, right? Absolutely. Who else would like to add to either the thesis or the contemporary analysis for the reading, or your contemporary analysis for the reading?
I don't think I have the exact thesis, but I just wrote down that African Americans and Mexican descendants in Americas before Christopher Columbus were said to discover America in the late 1400s.
Okay. So just the presence of the Africans and the indigenous people prior to Columbus. Absolutely.
Our thesis, what our group talked about, similar to what Harlan said, of the interactions between the Africans that moved to Central and South America, and interactions and trades to like in kind of like in intertwine kind of exchange of like cultural and like ritualistic aspects.
I think the intertwining or the exchange of culture is a good way to assess that. Perfect. Let's move to the contemporary analysis. What do some of you have for the contemporary analysis? How does this information speak to our world in 2023?
For me, it seemed like, well, now to this day, we do still kind of like interact and share things between cultures. And even now, even if, someone that isn't in like the same culture as you guys can talk and still kind of, I don't know, have like um, a relatable aspect to your guys' life. Like even if you might not have grew up exactly the same, there's still certain things where it's like, oh yeah, we did that too, or my family had this going.
So what you're speaking to is like a cultural similarity, so to speak. Yeah. Perfect. Anyone else? How does this fit in today's world? Go ahead, Ruben.
Yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting. You can kind of tell the difference in interactions with cultures, how when Black people kind of interacted with brown cultures, there was like a peaceful exchange of information and language and stuff like that. And as far as colonialism or imperialism, there was kind of a violent clash between, or just a takeover in general, genocide. So you can kind of see the mentality of, I guess, the people who came over to the South Americas and the Americas, and it was more so on kind of like spreading a different type of feel and not really taking over, but kind of exchanging, wanting to see what was going on. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of interesting to see. And also with the language too, how you can trace certain words to the Mandingos that came over and how it stayed. So it shows you they had a more than it was like a friendship. You know, they came in, they made friends, and they made peace, and they would establish relationships, and that's the only way you can get people to speak like you voluntarily. So that was kind of interesting.
I think that's a really good call out, Ruben, in the sense of like the difference, right? The distinctions between how colonialism came in as a foreign entity juxtaposed to how these African peoples came into the Americas. It's not a domineering type of essence. It's more of a we'll work with you. You know, it's a collective and a cohesive essence. Good call out. So what does the reading say about the possibilities, the implications for contemporary, for modern day Black and brown relations?
Can you kind of just explain that question?
Yeah, okay. Let's think about it this way. I'll rephrase the question with another question. If we're thinking about our era today, if we're thinking about a modern time, how are the dynamics between Black folks and so-called indigenous or so-called brown folks? How are those dynamics? Go ahead, Ruben.
Well, I was gonna say it's kind of the same except the religion part. I know it's a lot of Mexicans that say the N word. So you kind of got that same dynamic in that sense. I got Mexican homies. I know a lot of Mexicans that wear J's and kind of got Black culture in them and stuff, and so there's always an exchange. Their music has spirit in it, just like our music does. So you can kind of see it's not to the point where we're exchanging like religious views and stuff like that. So you can kind of see the difference, but there's definitely still a relationship there.
Yeah, I think especially with us in California, right? Like we have these spatial confluences, right, where we share the same spaces. But you say, it's staying. That you still see these type of cultural confluences between the two groups. Does anyone else have a different assessment of that, or does anyone else want to contribute to that portion of the conversation? What are the dynamics between Black and brown right now, or indigenous folks and African folks? And then what does the book say about the possibilities? Go ahead, Harlan.
I could contribute to that to add on to Ruben's point. I would say there's definitely influence as far as culture. Talk about music, and Ruben is right. Religion wouldn't be a part of that, but there's also Afro Latinos that kind of blend in with us as well. Talk about food as well. It's universal. Most of us use the same herbs and spices and things of that nature. My girl is Mexican, so I have a lot of learning to do. And I've traveled to her country and seen things that I've never seen before. And yeah, and then outside of that, not to go on a tangent, but we also have similar struggles too, as far as middle, low class, things of that nature, dealing with racial profiling, police, things of that nature as well. So
perfect. Thank you. So for me, when I thought about phrasing this, right, I'm being attentive to the rifts, if you will, between the two communities, right? And I would argue that a lot of the rifts that stem from these two communities, there's two forces that are at play from these rifts, right? One is prison culture, right? A lot of the beefs that play out in this prison culture spill off into the streets. And then also very much in line with that is the gang culture, right? Especially being in Southern California and LA, very high gang influence and gang culture here. I grew up in Pomona. I live in Claremont, which is the border of Pomona. So, especially in Pomona as of late, right? The Mexican population has grown tremendously, which has also heightened the activity of Mexican gangs, right? And there was a time, I want to say maybe 5 to 7 years ago, where there were certain streets in Pomona that if you was Black, you could not go down because there was a green light on, right? I lived in East Los for a good portion of, I don't know, maybe about 2 or 3 years when I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA, off of Breed and 4th Street, right? Very high gang concentration. I think is Breed. It's a gang called Breed. I don't know what they are, what their affiliations are, but several times during my stay there, I got banged on, right, and got hit up for where I'm from, right? So I'm thinking about how the prison and gang culture has caused a divide between these two communities. And for me, I think what both Ruben and Harlan are pointing to is the possibilities that this book points us to is the ability for these two communities to come together, right? Being attentive to the sameness within these communities juxtaposed to the things that separate them and kind of put them at odds with one another. I think another way to think about that conversation and as it pertains to the rift that's been drawn between these two communities, and I'll work this through a question as well. If you hear the term race, but we're not talking about an identity, right? We're not talking about your racial identity. What other ways is race used within our English language?
I feel like people, when I think of race, I think of the human race, like as one.
Okay, but that's still an identity, Olivia. So let's like kind of shift away from identity. How else do we think about race when we hear this term?
Would class be considered an identity in that aspect?
Well, I think race and class are two separate things. Your class is going to dictate your financial identity, while race will make up more of your ethnic and cultural identity. So no, but I'm still thinking within the term, think about the term race, right? You hear this term race before, but not talking about someone's identity. How is that term used?
A competition.
Perfect. Thank you, Kaden. That's what I was looking for. Competition, sport, right? You compete with one another. 100-yard dash is a race, it's a competition. 200 meter dash is a race, it's a competition, right? So why is it that they would use this term race, which signifies competition, to signify someone's ethnic makeup or their ethnic identity? Where is the confluence between those terms, competition and someone's identity? Why would you think they would use that term race to signify competition? Go ahead, Ruben.
Probably is like a ranking mechanism, and I guess if you want other people to feel less than, you gotta make something greater than. That's kind of.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, right? And there's this book called The Mismeasure of Man. I forget who the author is. I think the last name is Gould, but essentially he traces back the origins of these notions like race, right? But not the origins of race, but the stratification of race, the ranking system of race, right? And where, to me, the confluence between competition and ethnic identity stems from a competition over resources, right? Who's going to get the best jobs? What racial group will have the best job opportunities? Which racial group will have the social support programs, right? This is what the competition becomes. This is why you hear things, and I'm thinking back to like the early 2000s when I was kind of organizing in LA, and a large concern for the Black community in LA was the indigenous people moving into historically Black neighborhoods and taking away job opportunities and housing opportunities from Black folks, right? And for me, one of the things I kind of questioned was this notion of indigenous people taking jobs from Black folks, right? And the way it's framed, and oftentimes it echoes a lot of these conservative right-wing pundits, right? That these illegals will come over and take your job, right? And this promotes this idea of fear that there's scarcity in job opportunities, right? But if we kind of take a step back and think about it, what so-called illegals are going to take jobs that Black folks typically occupy. You're not. The type of work that these two groups do is vastly different, right? And I'm not putting one type of work above the other, but what I'm trying to point you to is how this notion that there's not enough, in this case, jobs, right? It creates a scenario to where one group is against the other group. And now I look at this group as a threat because they are imposing on my opportunities to get jobs. Where in reality, this idea or this notion that there's lack is a misnomer. There's really enough jobs for everyone to have jobs, right? There's really enough food for everyone to have food. How much food do these restaurants throw away on a daily basis? Tons of food, right? Economically, you know that there is no, the dollar is not backed by any type of financial mechanism. You know that, right? You could just print money out as you see fit, right? Whereas before, it was backed by the gold standard, so you had to have enough gold reserve to be able to print out these dollars, right? That's no longer the case. So the US Treasury could just go and print out as much money as it wants, right? So why is it this notion that there's not enough money to go around? How many empty homes, how many empty apartments, how many empty hotel rooms are there for us to have this uncontrollable housing crisis that we have, where we have people with housing insecurities all over the city, right? So it's not a question of not having the opportunity, not having the access, not having the space, right? It's more a reality of we exist within a system that is dependent on two groups competing for one another, competing with one another for resources, right? Because if you believe that jobs are scarce, you'll be willing to do any type of job because you feel like you have no other options. But if you know that there's enough jobs for everyone to go around, you may be a little bit more selective in the type of work that you choose to do, right? So what I want you all to understand that the forces that keep us divided are not intrinsic, right? They're not internal within us. They're outside forces. They're social forces that come into play and they seek to pit one group against the other group, right? And as we're pitted against each other, none of us are paying attention to the puppet masters, if you will, the powers that be that are placing one group against the other group. Being that we live in Southern California, the two groups predominantly play out in our context within Black folks and Indigenous folks, right? So for me, this is why the reading of They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima is profoundly important for understanding that there was a time where African people and Indigenous people came together and produced beautiful culture. So I'll get into the reading. I'm not going to lecture for too long just because I want to leave time for Fishbowl, and I want to kind of like discuss with you all some things that you found important of the reading. Also, what's important for me, as I think if you recall back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about this notion of the African diaspora, right? And the African diaspora is as a byproduct of scattering, okay? And I said that it's important to note that the scattering is not a production of enslavement, right? African people came to the Americas centuries before Columbus, right? And I mentioned Abu Bakr II. This provides further evidence to the fact that African people had presence here in the Americas, and that was not a byproduct of enslavement, right? Let me ask you this. What is the largest river in the world? The world's largest river.
The Nile?
The Nile, thank you. So where is the Nile, Ruben? Just for those who may
Africa.
not. Africa, in Kemet, right? So historically, the Nile was kind of used like the 10 freeway, right? It was used also as a travel port, right? And you would be able to go from the northern part of Africa to the southeastern part of Africa using the Nile, right? So with that in mind, it makes sense as to why African people had the knowledge to be able to travel the seas. They were building boats to traverse the Nile, right? So they had a nautical culture, they had a maritime culture. In fact, if you think about how keen they were on observing the stars, right? they use their astrological science to be able to help them navigate the waters. So if I know that this star is letting me know that I'm traveling north in the desert, I could get on the ocean and still follow that star north, right? So we're going to use that same type of knowledge and know-how to expand our travels beyond Africa, okay? So this knowledge is what allows African people to migrate to the Americas. In fact, if you read Christopher Columbus's journals, he tells you as to how he has West African individuals on the ship as they're traveling to the Americas, and they're helping him navigate and get to the western part, to the Western Hemisphere, right? So these are just further evidence that supports the African presence in the Americas. So I'm looking at page 93. Towards the middle of the page, it says, these Black merchants from the hot lands sold vivid colored mantles of cotton cloth. The cloaks so richly dyed, they seemed to copy the iridescent plumage of the birds, so various in design that the radial wheels of the sun, feathers and stylized shells, the skins of tigers, the forms of rabbits, snakes, fishes, and butterflies mingled in the myriad of motifs with triangles, polygons, crosses, squares, and crescents. Together, these garments they brought into the marketplace, golden ear pendants, smoking pipes, with some with the heads of traders carved on the bowl, exotic stones and shells. It continues, they came at first in twos and then in small band. Their coming attracted attention, but this was less because of the extraordinariness of their appearance. Foreigners all were expected to look different than the extraordinariness of their wares. So they're not really tripping about how they look different, right? I'm not really tripping off of their skin color, but I'm more bugging off of how extraordinary their clothing was, right? Some of the luxuries they offered in the common marketplace had been enjoyed almost exclusively by the noblemen and kings of Mexico, who seem to have had some earlier contact with him. So this is important because it shows you, while he's describing the scene of more of the common indigenous folks seeing the Africans come onto the scene, right? He's letting you know that, well, the noblemen and the Mexican kings already had contact with these African folks because some of the things that they're trading off in the marketplace, the noblemen had already, right? In the reign of the Quasapasanic, I think that's how you pronounce that, they had suddenly appeared, the spearhead of a larger migrating group. Out of what world they had originally came, no one knew, but they trickled in from the direction of the south and the southeast. It seemed as if everyone were on the move at the same time. All sorts of people were gravitating towards the lakes to form the nucleus of New Mexico. So think back to last week's reading and the destruction of Black civilization. And he talks about how everyone migrated to Kemet because of the how vast the land was, how perfect it was for growing, and how fertile the land was, right? Kind of the same thing is taking place here in Mexico. Everyone is migrating to this location because it has so much to offer, right? And African folks are migrating there as well. Let me see. Looking at page 94, towards the bottom of page 94, it says, the Blacks had built a temple in the town as soon as they formed a sizable kapulai. And a kapulai is just like a community, right? In the forecourt of this temple, they set up the wooden statue of a werewolf who was their Nagual. This statue fascinated him. So the first thing that they do is when they get set up is they set up a temple, right? They build a temple. Now, to me, if we think about what we learned of ancient Kemet and we think about the spiritual nature of African people, it would make sense the first thing that they do when they have a sizable group is they set up the temple, right? They want to be able to conduct the same type of spiritual practices that they had back home where they're currently located, right? I'm looking at the next page, first full paragraph. He was not the only one of the feather workers who was fascinated by these strangers. The attraction of men from the hot lands who provided them with exquisite new material for their trade was overwhelming. It was not long before they were drawn also to the Nagual and began to join in their rituals and festivities. Even though he himself had never worshipped the coyote Nagual, These were the men with whom he had eventually did most of his business, and they had become his good friends. He had been allowed to stand on the edge of the parricide as the masked men chanted and danced on the day of the festivals. So I think this kind of goes back to Ruben's point, right? These African people come in, they start to do what African people do. They're building their temples, right? They're having their spiritual ceremonies. And the native folks are kind of observing this and they're becoming interested, right? Not only interested in the materials that they're bringing for trade, but they're becoming interested in their practices. And they allow them to observe those spiritual practices, right? So again, vastly different from colonialism, right? Where they'll come in with the explorers, or the anthropologists, then followed by the missionaries, right? Who are going to ensure not only do you have the option to convert to our religion, right? You're going to be forced to convert to this religion under the knife and the gun, right? This is vastly different. I'm going to do my thing. If you want to watch, cool, watch. You know, if you want to participate, you can participate too. You don't have to. You can keep your own customs, but this is what we do over here. And you're more than willing to observe, you know. I'm looking at page 96 towards the middle of the page, and I think gives us a very interesting insight to the connection and the cultural confluence. It says, it is with Mexico, however, that we are most concerned, for here we can see the confluence of cultures, not just the confluence of bloods. When we compare the coat of the werewolf, that coyote of the prairies, found among the Amateca, with the coat of the coyote of the with the coat of the werewolf, the hyena of the savannas, found among the Bambara of medieval Mali, we see quite clearly that we are at the head of that very confluence. So one, he says Mexico is important for two reasons, right? One, obviously, there's a confluence of blood, right? Because when you have two groups that get together, they're gonna mingle, right? You have two people who come together, they're gonna fuck, right? They're gonna have babies, right? So the blood, that's not too fascinating, right? Because that's a normal human phenomenon. When groups get together, they're gonna have babies, boo, 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 blood's gonna get mixed. But what is more fascinating is the cultural confluence, right? The spiritual, the religious confluence that takes place. And check this out. It says that when you compare the cult of the werewolf, right, that coyote of the prairies, found among the Amateca, with the cult of the werewolf, the hyena of the savannas, found among the Bambara of medieval Mali, you see we're at the head of the confluence. So one of the things here, think about it. In the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, there are no hyenas, right? Hyenas are predominantly found in Africa, correct? So if you have a religious ceremony, if you have a spiritual practice that honors hyenas, and you're in a location that doesn't have any hyenas, what are you going to do? You're going to do the next best thing. We don't have hyenas in Americas, but we do have our coyotes. They look a little bit alike. So, because I can't do a hyena, I'm going to do a coyote, right? Because that's the best thing that we come up with. But whereas here in the Americas, they had a religious practice, right? And that was the code of the werewolf, right? And that is the equivalent of a hyena, but they don't have hyenas here, so you have to do the next best thing, right? So you see within these two vastly different cultures from two vastly different hemispheres, they have a similarity in spiritual practices. And that similarity stems from what we read earlier about allowing these native folks from the Americas, these indigenous folks, to observe how these African people are spiritually practicing and worshiping their gods, right? And taking what's here to stand in the place for which you don't have. So again, we don't have hyenas, but we do have coyotes, so we'll supplement that, right? I'm not gonna go into the language thing. But again, but looking at page 97 at the bottom of the page, it says again, the festival of the werewolf god was celebrated in both cultures twice a year. In Mali, the god is smeared in blood, usually chicken blood. In Mexico, where human sacrifices was habitual and only slightly mediated by the humanity of the Kwanzaa cult. Blood is provided in the first of the two festivals by humans. So again, he's pulling the similarities, right? In Mali, they had blood sacrifices, but they use chickens, whereas in Mexico, they use human blood sacrifices. But the day that they worshiped and the type of worship that they did was exactly the same, right? So again, you see this cultural confluence. That's the language. Okay, I'll end with this one here on page 101. It says the relationship may now be seen very clearly between the Amanteca of Mexico and the Amatigi or Namatigi of Mali. The worship of the werewolf totem, or Nagual, underwent very few changes indeed in its transplantation from Mali to Mexico. As in all transplantations, the local fauna and material simply replaced the original. The hyena became the coyote, the stick knobbed with sheep's horns became the stick knobbed with black stones. The bright tropical birds of Africa had their feathers matched by the rich plumes of South America, quetzalcoatl bird. But the basic complex of ideas and their unique organization remained behind as skeletal evidence of their African origins. The identicals are so staggering that one feels one is looking into a mirror at both the Mexican and Mali magicians would call the shadow of the twin or the spirit double. So again, he's just speaking to the similarities in religious practices between these two spiritual practices. Also, what I want to show you all real quick, 1 second. I don't know if you had a chance to look this up, because this is another form of evidence that Van Sertima uses to support the African presence in Americas prior to Columbus. And these are these like Olmec heads, right? I'll move this over here. And if you see these images here, look at his nose, very broad nose. Look at those lips, very broad lips. Look at, try to get an image of the back of the head. Yeah, here you go. What are these? What does that look like to you all?
Braids.
Braids, right? So, I mean, given the nose, given the lips, given the hair, right? It's really hard to deny the African presence within that statue, right? Just like they said the aliens built the pyramids, their excuse for the Olmec's heads were that these big ass stones rolled down a mountain. And as they rolled down the mountain and they hit like rocks or what have you, those incisions were made, and that's how these Olmec heads came out with their African essence. I mean, that don't sound like some bullshit to y'all. I don't know what to call it, right? That sounds ridiculous juxtaposed to African people traveling across the waters and carving out these stones. That sounds more practical to me. But I'll put my lecture on pause there. We'll open it up for Fishbowl. Again, you have 2 per semester, 1 time to pass. You could talk about the lecture, you could talk about your journal, or what was discussed in your breakout rooms. Would anyone like to volunteer?
Can I go?
Got Yerman. Anyone else like to volunteer before I start calling at random? All right, so I'll call that random. Again, you have 1 time to pass. If you have not, if you passed already, then you don't have any time to pass. Jonathan Gutierrez, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
Just something about the text that I found, like that I found.
Anything that you found interesting. Let me get one more person,
Okay.
then we'll open it up. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Naomi, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Can I pass today?
Let me just make sure you haven't passed already. Yeah, you actually have passed already, so you don't have an option to pass.
Oh, I did not remember that. Okay.
Looks like on from what I wrote down. The 13th. Actually, no, check that, check that. That's not your pass. That's something else. Okay, you're good. So you still have your pass, Naomi. I'm sorry. Francisco, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yeah, I'll fishbowl.
All right, we have Jeremy and Jonathan and Francisco. Who would like to start us off?
I just wanted to talk about like how you said that like indigenous people takes jobs from like Africans and like not only like them but like just everyone like among like different like races. I feel like we have to stop seeing it as a competition between different races and just see it as like individuals competing because after all competition is everywhere and like framing that as like oh I have to be better than this race, I have to be better than that race. I feel like it just increases hate between people and it like enforces racism in a way. um so I feel like race should like stay out from like in terms of like those competing and all that. Instead, we can like learn from each other and just learn to like harmonize.
Thank you. We have Jonathan and Francisco. Who's next?
Adding on to what you said, Yaram, I agree with what you said. Similar event happened to me because I'm also from Mexico. So they would like, make these comments like, oh, Mexicans are gonna take your jobs because they're illegally crossing the border and stuff. And like saying things like that just like, creates tension among people, especially what I've seen from like the white people and Mexicans. I've seen a lot of that happening around experiences that as well. And yeah, it's like I agree with what you said about keeping race out of like the competition wise.
Jonathan?
Yeah, a bit different. On the text on page 102. I just find it interesting how the origin of words come from like the culture. For example, it says here that like it traces back to like a word in called folum. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but comes from rich man and merchant. And it's very interesting seeing these words surrounding like our cultures and stuff, and how their origin and how they come to be. Yeah, I think it's interesting.
Thank you, Jonathan. What I would like to kind of circle back to Francisco and Yerman's comments around competition and the racial signification behind the competition. Yeah, we could get rid of the racial component of it, right? But like, let's be real, we're in a race-based society. There's, in a way that the American populace operates, there's no way to extract race from these conversations. This is a country that is built on race, right? It's a country that's built on these racial stratifications and identifications. I think the more and really, race isn't the problem, right? Inherently, because you identify as Black or Mexican or wherever the case may be, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is the competition, right? Like, let's put it on the table very clearly. What I was trying to get you to understand was that's the issue, is this false notion of competition, right? Because if we're going to use Francisco's example, the migrant communities coming over to take folks' jobs, right? So if they're so-called undocumented, there's certain jobs that they cannot do because of their status. Am I wrong? Right. So there's no threat that someone has who is documented of that individual taking their job. It's a dog whistle, right? It's used just to stoke the fire and animosity of two opposing groups. It's not a real thing, right? Again, the lack of jobs is not because of certain groups are taking jobs from another group, right? This is a system that's dependent on, there's an idea that there is not enough. This notion that there's not enough is why we're competing. But what I'm saying to you is more than enough. We have more than enough food. We have more than enough housing. We have more than enough jobs. We have more than enough opportunities. It's just being gatekept in a way that allows for certain people to have access and certain people not to have access. And for those who don't have access, you're being forced to compete with one another so you could feel like you have secured yourself some kind of security, right? This is really what it's all about. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that is a false notion. There's no need for competition in these realms. There's enough for everybody, is what I'm trying to get you to understand, right? What would society be like? And this is something that can be done, right? This is something that can be done. What would society be like if your housing was provided for you? If your healthcare was provided for you? If everyone had equal opportunity to jobs, if everyone had equal opportunity to employment and education, right? What would our society look and feel like if that was the reality? Because what that does, it eliminates the need for competition. Think back to the teachings of Ptah-hotep. The desire of Ptah-hotep was to what? Eliminate strife, eliminate bickering, eliminate arguments, eliminate competition, right? So what I'm trying to get you to think about, if your basic needs are met, your ability to have shelter, your ability to provide for your family, your ability to educate yourself, right? Your ability to receive good quality healthcare. If those needs were met, what that does, it elevates the cost of, not the cost of living, it elevates the quality of life, right? And then a lot of these things that we are at odds with each other about won't be necessary. So what I want you to understand, and what I want you to take away from this conversation around competition, is not interpersonal, right? It's not intergroup that's causing the competition. It's a capitalist system that is built on one group or several groups competing against one another, right? When I was growing up, there was this old adage: if you white, you all right. If you yellow, you mellow. If you brown, you can stick around. If you black, get back, right? And this adage, it symbolizes the racial power structure within this country, right? White. They call Asian folks the model minority, which is some bullshit, right? But this is what they classified them as. Then you have so-called brown folks, followed at the very bottom by black folks, right? What this does, it creates a scenario to where everyone's trying to climb this stratified ladder to get to the top, and the top is whiteness. So when you do cross over and you're trying to earn your citizenship and you have to take those tests, right? You're being tested to be a good American. How can you perform whiteness? And if you can perform whiteness, you're able to come on into this country and be a good citizen. Part of that performing whiteness is turning a down eye or turning your nose up to black folks, right? That's part of the American patriotism, right? Because it helps maintain this stratification. So this competition, this stratification is all designed to help certain segments of this population, right? So that's why I need you to understand, like, if we are to get rid of this notion of competition, then race is not inherently a problem. Does that make sense? Talk back to me. What y'all think about that?
Oh yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I guess it's like I guess growing up, you're like, the idea of like competition like so pushed into you, like, oh, you try to go into the best schools, you gotta like, gotta be great this, be accepted into the best schools, get the best jobs and stuff like that. I feel like we've been brainwashed to think of like that way.
Yep. It's called the Protestant work ethic, right? It's part of this same notion of our brainwashing, our indoctrination. A good citizen will work 40 hours a week and not question it. In fact, you may do overtime because you want to show that I'm a great worker. But again, all that is going to is into the pockets of who you work for. Harlan, what do you do? What's your company that you work for?
I work with two companies, but the job I'm at right now, I'm in San Dimas. It's called McKinley. Children's Care Center, and I work with unaccompanied minors that come into the US. So they stay here for about a week or two, and we try to reunite them with their sponsors across the US. So my job is the activities coordinator. So I provide recreation activities for these kids. There's a school on site. We have case managers and clinicians, as well as nurses on site as well.
So I'm not, I don't mean to talk shit about your work, because what you actually do is productive and positive is necessary, right? And I think especially with the conversation that we're having, the work that you do is right in alignment with what we're discussing. But the point I'm trying to make, you get a check from this company, correct?
Yeah.
The person who signs that check, I assume, gets a lot more motherfucking money than you do, correct?
It's facts.
Yep. So if you were to do things like overtime, right, you may get a little increase in your money, but that overtime hours that you're putting in is ultimately going to benefit the person who cuts your check, correct?
Of course.
All right. So this is why I'm trying to get us to understand, right? We've been trained to perform these duties that don't serve us. It benefits a capitalist system that sees you as a number to be commodified off of. It sees you as a number that they're trying to get the most efficiency out of you as possible. So from the time that Harlan checks in at work to the time that Harlan clocks out at work, his ass is theirs, right? That's what efficiency, that's what job efficiency is about. And they don't want to see you deviating from the work that you should be doing while on the clock, right? I worked for Apple before I started lecturing. It's the same thing. So again, think back to the teacher Ptah-hotep. Do no more than is required to take care of your family. And then satisfy your heart, follow your heart, right? So once we kind of lose sight of those things, you would get lost in these competitions, and we can be placed at odds with one another for no viable reason. Again, why history becomes important, because history shows us that there's another way to exist. There was a time when these two communities came together and they produced beautiful and harmonious culture, right? Real quick, before you head out, just want to point to you the readings for what, Monday? Or sorry, Wednesday, excuse me. So for Wednesday's course, we'll be discussing the souls of Black folks. So please read that and come prepared to discuss that for Wednesday. W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks. We're reading the first chapter of our spiritual striving. So it's not too long, but I will say about this particular reading that you will do, it's dense. It's really wordy. It's written in the early 1900s, so it sounds like that. So kind of be prepared to work through some of that. Don't expect to know everything. Just struggle through it and come ready to discuss, and I'll help crystallize the things that you may not have. Bring your questions with you as well, so that way we can discuss any questions you may have. Really, this is a text we probably should spend 2 days with, but we're only going to spend 1 day. So please come prepared to engage in discussion.